Welcome to Lighting Design, Wellbeing, and Healthcare Environment, a webinar brought to you by Medical Construction and Design magazine and sponsored by Cree Lighting. If you have not already downloaded a copy of the presentation materials, you can do so from the link on your screen. We'll be taking questions at the conclusion of the presentation. At any time, you can type your questions into the text box on your screen and then press enter. Questions will be read aloud, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible and as time permits. If your question is not answered, we'll try to respond to you afterwards. Our speaker today is Jeff Hungarter. Jeff is the Director of Commercial Indoor Lighting with Cree Lighting. He has 20 years of experience in commercial lighting, and Hungarter is a member of the Illuminating Engineering Society and has a bachelor's degree in marketing from Western New England University and a master's in business from Fairleigh Dickinson University. And now I would like to please welcome Jeff Hungarter.
Thanks. So appreciate everyone spending some time with us this afternoon. We'll try and make this as fun and interesting as we can. The idea around this is lighting for the healthcare space and what it can do for not just visibility and light in terms of visibility, but light in terms of kind of health and wellness. So before we get started, I think we have one polling question. What is your familiarity with human-centric lighting? Are you just beginning to explore the concept? Are you already planning to implement human-centric lighting in your projects? Or you've already used human-centric lighting principles in some of your projects? There'll be a...
looks like we have some data coming back. 18%, I've already used human-centric lighting principles in my projects. And I'm just beginning to explore the concept. 58%, that's 47 answers. I'm ready to, planning to implement human-centric lighting in my projects, 22%, and I have already used centric lighting principles in my projects, 20%.
Okay. Good. So it looks like, most of us, and this is pretty much standard across the industry, a lot of us are just getting to explore the concept. We understand that there's this element of, the human element that's becoming more and more important in design. So it's interesting just to see, how that broke out. So let's talk about lighting for the healthcare environment. When we think about lighting for healthcare, we need to think about it in all the different various kind of sub-applications. So obviously healthcare is pretty broad. There are lots of different types of healthcare spaces. If we think about, hospitals versus, elderly care centers versus clinics, every one of those spaces is going to be different. And then within those spaces, there's these kind of sub-applications or subspaces that are also going to need, different types of either task lighting or, lighting for just general use. Some of those spaces, we talk about our waiting rooms, nurses' stations, right? So how you light a waiting room is going to most likely be different than a nurse's station, because a lot of times the waiting rooms are towards the edges of the building. There is sometimes some natural light that's designed in, versus a nurse's station is generally, the center hub, right? So that's going to be in the middle of the space. And so there's going to be different light considerations that need to be taken and different ways throughout the day that you may want to light that space. So while the waiting room may have a constant, light level because people are coming in and out, and you want to make sure that the entrance and the way they get out is lit properly, a nurse's station you may want to follow a certain light level and a color temperature to keep the nurses on their circadian rhythm. And we'll talk about what that means and the effects of that, and even some products that are out there that can help do that. And then you can see just some of the other spaces. Again, all of these, you want to have one cohesive look when you're doing a space, but they're all going to take into account some different considerations about what actual task is happening in that space, and that's going to determine a lot of things. So what are some of the considerations, right? What are some of those activities? And when we look at kind of at the higher level, we talked about, a hospital versus a long-term care versus a clinic, even versus some office space, right? So a lot of healthcare spaces have your, standard, offices for doctors or other people, administrative staff that are in that space. So even, different tasks within that same space can require different and varied light levels. So you may have a space that is used to kind of do a pre-diagnosis of when someone's coming in, but it also may have to, if there's no time, there may have to be a certain amount of critical care that's also done in that space, or the ability to do some type of critical care in that space. So there may be a switch on the wall or something that, you're able to switch from kind of a normal mode to a critical mode, and you're able to do various tasks in that same space. So that's why controls are really important. And we'll touch on, where controls are today with LED lighting and where they're going to go, because there's lots of cool stuff that with LED being digital, it allows controls, one, to be installed and commissioned a lot easier, but it also allows for lots of things that were never possible with older incumbent technology like fluorescent or HID lighting. So one thing, we need guiding principles. We can't just make our own subjective determination of what kind of light levels we need for this space. So how do we understand where to start? And again, people in the lighting design world, architectural specifying, they understand that, the IES is that group, that nationally recognized group that they go to. And the great thing about this is they will break it down for you to the hospital and healthcare facility level, and then they'll break it down into all these different kind of sub-levels that we talked about, nurses stations, treatment spaces, and they'll give you that recommended idea of, how many foot candles, right? Foot candles is the measure of, how much light you're getting at a surface, right? So how many foot candles do I need in a nurse's station versus a treatment space versus a patient room? And all of that has to do with all the different types of tasks that can be done in that type of space. So, RP 2916, if you're taking notes at home, that is the recommended RP, recommended practice. And I believe 16 is kind of the last year that it was just recently updated. So, these get updated every few years. It takes actually a few years for the IES to kind of come to an agreement on, what those practices, need to be changed to. So if light levels need to be changed in a certain space, or the distribution of light, controls, how that plays in. So there's lots of different things that go into making these up. So really good kind of guideline to help you understand, what you need when you're designing into these spaces. So let's dive into, some of these different spaces and just kind of have a discussion about, something like a common area, right? So this could be anything from a lobby to a corridor or cafeteria. And what's interesting about this is, in the past, again, when we think about lighting design in healthcare, it was about probably hitting a budget number. I need X amount of fixtures. I need it to save me X amount of money. But now those spaces have become kind of more of around the patient experience, right? And really trying to make the patient feel like they're going to have a good experience, right? And that can start all the way out in the parking garage, right? And so we've seen a lot of projects where They've upgraded their parking garage facilities with better lighting to give the people that are coming in there a lot more comfort and that they're safe. Because parking garages can have lots of dark corners and spaces where, you might think somebody's going to, maybe pop out, or a car is going to come and not going to see you. So the experience really does start kind of in that parking garage or parking deck. But then it really, when you walk into a space, if it's kind of, dark and dingy, the walls are not recently painted and the lighting is flickering, you're already probably not feeling great because you're already in a healthcare facility for some reason. And that's just not going to do very good for kind of your health and well-being psychologically, to see kind of like, oh, this is my worst nightmare. So spaces are really putting a lot more money into their lobby and corridor area to make people feel almost more like a hotel or kind of an event experience. And so the lighting in that space, there's a larger percentage of lighting, the lighting budget that is actually getting moved into these spaces from other spaces, right? So when people are looking to spend a little bit more money on a really nice chandelier or some type of nice linear fixture, that is where this money is kind of coming. So it's really interesting how that's kind of transformed in the healthcare space. And then, you have places like your lobbies and cafeterias, right, which are, again, those are spaces where there may not be a lot of action going on, but it's spaces where people, want to come when they need to take a break from either visiting, maybe they're visiting their family member, or the staff is taking a break from, they have maybe a short break where they're able to grab something. So, those spaces are getting obviously consideration, and they're looking at making those cafeteria spaces more inviting and almost more like like a restaurant feel versus just having kind of plain tables and almost like a school cafeteria. They're actually trying to upgrade that experience to make it feel like a restaurant. So mentally, you're getting a break from the everyday, the feeling of being in a hospital all the time. So again, it's all tying back a little bit to kind of that health and wellness. Spaces like examination rooms, obviously very important, right? So the specifications for lighting in this space are very critical because this is where a lot of those diagnoses are going to come from. You need things like, in those other spaces, corridors, for instance, you may need only 50-foot candles. But in this space, you need double that, right? Which is, roughly 100-foot candles at the horizontal plane during an exam. But then you also want the ability to go back to kind of 30 to 50-foot candles when, the exam is not necessarily happening, right? Because 100-foot candles on a 9 or 10-foot ceiling is fairly bright. So you probably don't want to be, sitting under that light all the time because it's going to be kind of put a strain on your eyes. So having controls and having that ability to kind of go back and forth is obviously very important. And then we talk about the nurses station. So again, we're helping define the patient experience, but also investing in the staff, right? So, you have these hubs that generally are in the middle of the buildings, which means that they don't necessarily have a lot of access to natural light. And lots of studies have shown about the improvement of not only things like, patient recovery, but, diagnosis, or even, in schools, things like, kids that have access to natural light and the learnings that they get from that. Some of their test scores are even better. And just the natural well-being of people. Everyone always wants to, sit next to the window, right? Everyone always wants the office with the window. So we know that there's this craving, deep down for all of us to be outside or have some connection with nature. And so it's really important to make sure that you take the time when you're designing these spaces to take into account the people that are going to be in that space. And for the nurses stations, it could be something as simple as having color tunable lights that actually, change color, temperature, and light output as the day goes on, and that could give them some feeling unconsciously in a way that where they are in the day, right? Because they're just going from patient room to patient room, and they doing their charts and everything, and they generally don't get a big lunch break, right? Like a lot of other jobs might get, right? So allowing them just unconsciously to have an idea of, okay, it's crisp blue, it's really like a 5,000 Kelvin cool blue, and it's really bright. We must be close to noon, because that's what their cycle is telling them, kind of unconsciously. And that's what we just talked about here, right? So, you see up at the top right, this is kind of a troffer that's changing from, on the left, very warm, right? So you're talking like maybe 3,000 Kelvin, which again is kind of closer to an incandescent light source, and slowly moving over the course of the day from cool to kind of from warm to a little bit less warm, and then to kind of what we'd call something like a neutral, to cool, and then to something we may call daylight. And if you ever go walk into a Home Depot or a Lowe's and you're looking at light bulbs, you'll see a lot of them are marked, things like warm white or neutral, cool white, or daylight, right? And so the whole idea around daylight is it is supposed to give you the feeling of, what the actual measured spectrum is from the sun as it comes through the atmosphere. So it's important not only for something like color tunable light, but also indirect, soft, and low glare light, right? So making sure that you have even illuminance, through maybe it's an indirect mixing chamber, but basically making sure that, you're not, you don't have that one single point of brightness. You want to spread that light out and get that lighting uniformity as good as you can. And then obviously, the different control packages allow for the flexible spaces. So we talked a little bit about that. Mimicking what's happening outside is becoming more and more prevalent. And at the end of this, towards the end of this, we'll talk about a new solution that actually shows taking this even to the next level, right? So these are fixtures that kind of go from warm to cool, but what if you had a fixture that actually felt like a window or a skylight? And so we'll share a little bit more about what that is as we get towards the end. So, rehabilitation rooms, that's another one, right? So, it's not always just a quick trip to the doctor, in and out. A lot of times you're in a space for hours, and you're conscious, which is generally a good thing, but it also means that you have a lot of time on your hands to kind of take in your surroundings. So if you're getting chemo treatment or dialysis or anything like that, having the right lighting that's comfortable for those people in that space to, again, make that experience as comfortable as possible is just, again, really going to tie into kind of that whole story about their health and well-being. And, if we look at rehabilitation spaces, one of the products that we're going to talk about is this Arcadian dynamic skylight. And you can see it kind of up in the top corner here. And again, we'll have more pictures as we get towards the end about what that really looks like. But it's really, comes down to kind of an artificial skylight, right? And so you have a blue panel, which is the sky, and you have these sun panels. And the idea is for those people in that, in that rehab space, that they're going to get the best lighting experience that they could get, barring them being actually outside, right? So, we understand that, competing with Mother Nature is not what we're trying to do. It's really just trying to give people in that space some level of touchstone to what's actually happening outside. And what we've seen is the results show that is greatly a great improvement for not only physical health, right, and people getting motivated to do their rehab or things like that, but also mentally giving them just this feeling that, hey, I'm in a space and I can kind of have a touchstone to what's going on outside. So now let's dive into more specifically lighting for health and well-being, right? So we talked a lot about light and application in the last few slides, all the different spaces and the things that you need to take into consideration. But now let's kind of dive into more of the health and well-being part of it, which we haven't talked about as much. So what we do know is that light has biological and behavior effects just beyond visibility, right? And there's nothing, on a bright sunny day, obviously it's, everyone is outside walking, in the parks, and there's a reason for that, right? Because there is this behavioral effect that it gives them that you can't necessarily touch or see. And if we look back, right? So if we go back into the 1800s, right, with Thomas Edison, and we can debate, if who actually invented the light bulb, right? But at the end of the day, Edison is the one that made it so famous. So back in the day, there were shorter days. Electric light with the longer days is now a new phenomenon, right? Because in the past, you lived by the sun or candlelight, right? And so pretty much once the sun went down, there really wasn't much to do, other than maybe some things in the house. So we had brighter days, and we also had darker nights, right? Because with all the new light fixtures that are out for the roads and things like that, that's also caused, something they call light pollution, right? So light being just reflected off of the streets or the trees or the roads and reflected back up into the sky. And, there are also the IES has, certain regulations around that as well to make sure that we keep our dark skies dark, right? Because there's nothing better than, if you've ever been to the beach or maybe to the mountains where there's not a lot of just this, roads and light being, reflected up into the atmosphere. It's a lot easier to see the stars, and the sky is actually, feels to be a lot blacker and darker. And so, that was kind of what we had before electric light. But now, longer days are relatively the new phenomenon. So today our days are not bright enough, and our nights aren't dark enough. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But part of that has to do with technology and the fact that not only with lighting technology, right, because now we're able to, easily flip a switch and we have light, but we also have TVs. We also have our iPads and our iPhones, which, we can be glued to all the way up until minutes before we go to bed. And that also can obviously have some grave effects on, getting good sleep, which again can relate to melatonin creation, which we'll talk about here in a second. And we'll talk about it right now. So again, this whole clock of day and night, right? Your body is on this circadian cycle, and it's just it's naturally, trying to sleep at night and be awake during the day and be active. And so there's this cycle, right, that is continuously happening. And to have a very, consistent cycle is obviously promising, because that is going to get your body in sync with your brain. And when you do go to sleep, then you are going to have, the best amount of melatonin creation. And if you're doing a night shift or something like that, there's also been studies that show that your melatonin creation is greatly decreased because your body it's not natural for your body to be up from 7 p.m. at night to 7 a.m. in the morning. And even though you may be getting some very good sleep during the day, sometimes it can be hard to get what they call, that really deep sleep because you have, maybe light filtering in through your windows, or you have, there's lots more going on during the day. So you're maybe woken up by noises and sounds, or maybe other people in your family are awake during the day. And so you're not really getting the sleep you need to have that good, to get in that good rhythm. And by default, then, not having that kind of consistent melatonin creation, there are studies that also have shown that can, lead to, or in some cases, increase the chances of, certain things like cancer and things like that, because you're not having your body is not having what it needs to kind of go fight off some of these things. most people think about circadian rhythm, in terms of jet lag, right? So that's kind of the easiest way to think about it. If you haven't ever had to do kind of a night shift work, but you've traveled from the U.S. to, Shanghai or to L.A. or something like that across the country, you can kind of understand, what that might feel like. And that's a lot of people kind of go to, oh yeah, jet lag. I get that. And when we look at how the circadian clock is kind of controlled, it has a lot to do with light, right? So it has a lot to do with light coming in through the eye, and then that light going to kind of all these, different parts in the brain. Like obviously you have your biological clock, but then there's all these other, your hormones, your memory, motor activity. It's all being connected, with light. And so sometimes we underestimate the power of light or by getting a certain amount of light, what that might do to us. But it actually is, it's actually quite important. And like we talked about before, there's more than meets the eye, right? So there's the visible part of light that we use, right, which is the rods and the cones and understanding depth of perception and what something actually is. But there's all these other sensors that are kind of in the back that are doing a lot of other things. And one that was recently, I say recently, in the last 20 years or so was found is this IP RGC photoreceptor. And so this was found to basically, have a connection into, melatonin suppression and circadian clock reset. So this was kind of something new, a new sensor in the eye that was discovered, and it's become actually a very hot topic in the lighting industry in regards to healthcare. And so again, that's one where we don't have tons of time to dive into that specific photoreceptor, but something maybe you want to take a note of and kind of Google it later and do some research on your own. But it's really opened up the understanding for health and well-being in regards to lighting in the industry. So there's always this challenge, though, right? Because you want to do what's best, and you want to make sure that the person in the space is you're not affecting their well-being in a negative way. And in fact, you want to actually be improving their well-being if you can. But you have to balance that with the illumination, right? The actual visibility requirements of the space. So it's great if you can make someone feel, very comfortable in the waiting room with very dim lights and soft music. But it's really not practical, because if something happens while that person's waiting to be seen, and doctors need to come out and people actually need to do some work in that space, they're not going to be able to do anything because the lights are going to be too dim, and they may not be able to hear each other because there's music playing. So again, you have to have this balance between both visibility and human health. And so that comes down to really four different categories. So one is intensity. So when we talk about intensity, we are talking about, let's say, a measurement of foot candles or a measurement of, brightness, right? So low to medium to high, that would be kind of intensity. Spectrum. So spectrum, obviously, you can see here, has to do with color, right? So light is made up of different types of wavelengths that create different colors. And so understanding your eye takes those wavelengths in and does different things with them, and it sends different signals. So the spectrum of light is obviously important as well. Distribution, so that's the one bottom left, and again, that's really has to mean with the distribution of the light. So is the light coming vertically, hitting your eye, which has been seen recently with that new receptor that we found, light coming at the eye. So imagine a picture frame on a wall, and it's fully illuminated. And so what they're finding is something like that is actually allowing you to get more light into your eye, and is actually more effective than lighting from just overhead, right? So there's this concept now of lighting design that's changing, where it's not just putting fixtures in a ceiling, it's putting light, if you're at some type of desk or a bed, in a bed, or, standing at a counter, like they're actually looking at adding more light points, softer light points, but adding more light points kind of at a task level, because that has actually been being seen to improve, human health by, having more light get actually into the eye. And then duration, right? So the idea around how long, right? How long do I have this light level of intensity and spectrum? Maybe I have it for 2 hours, and then I can dim the lights back down again. And then maybe 3 hours later, I pop it back up for another hour. So that is, again, a measurement of understanding, how much light, what color spectrum, what type of distribution, and for how long. So those are all critical components. So we'll go to our polling question number 2. So if you just respond, what do you see as the top challenges to implementing human-centric lighting? So, balancing project priorities, which could be things like the one below it, right? Costs, that could be something, because it does tend right now to add a little bit of cost to a project. Or is it explaining the benefits to project stakeholders? Like, you may feel like it's a good idea, but you don't really know how to express it. Or just a flat need for more information.
We'll just take a moment here to finish the polling, then we'll publish it.
Great. Yeah, I see a lot of spread out answers. Really good. Okay. Like we've locked in. So yeah, I mean, it looks like most of you are saying, cost is, kind of the number one thing, which doesn't surprise me. When you talk about things like color tunable lighting, you talk about adding controls, to fixtures and creating kind of different networks. There is a cost associated with that, and that tends to be, in something, especially like a public healthcare facility or elderly care, where budget is generally the number one thing. And when you're looking through a package, lighting may be one where they look to, the first places they look to kind of cut some of that budget out when they need it. That's going to be, definitely a hurdle. So I think the more, obviously the more information you can get on why these things make sense, and as we gain more knowledge around this and more white papers and medical journals are writing about it, I think that will help kind of, create a backup story to, how important this is and why it is actually worth the money. And then, yeah, I think that kind of leads into the third one, right? So explaining the benefits, which is the number 2, looks like that's the second most challenge, is explaining the benefits, right? And again, that can be difficult, and I think that's where, obviously, leverage your, lighting community. If you're working with a lighting specifier or lighting designer, they're getting more and more into this, and they can always help the end user understand, how to build a story around that. Great. So ultimately, why should I care, right? And this kind of goes back to that polling question of, it's too complex, right? It's still too early. There's still lots of studies being done. There's groups out there that's all they do, right? The Lighting Research Center out of New York, Harvard, they have a lot of studies going on right now. But maybe is it too early? And I think the answer to that is, it's not too early. It's definitely not too early to educate yourself. You may want to take some time to understand, how far you might want to push it. But there are design guidance activities already happening. The IES, which we talked about before, who kind of writes those recommended practices, and they're kind of nationally recognized. I mean, they have a light and health technical committee, and they're working on a new recommended practice for daytime alertness. That's going to be TM-18 reaffirmed. So it was done out in 2018, but they're going to kind of reaffirm that, make any updates that need to be updated. And then once that's released, it would be released as a recommended practice. And then UL, obviously UL is very big on the safety from not just lighting, but all the way any type of electronic. You get a little UL approval, makes you feel good. But they're also looking at promoting circadian entrainment with light for day active people. So that's going to be DG 24480. And then probably the biggest one that I would say on new building concepts. So think about, new hospitals or new healthcare campus facilities, is really looking at well building. And right now we're kind of on a well building, I think version 2. There's 10 different kind of concept areas. We'll go through them real quick, but lighting is only just one of them, right? So the thing I like about the well building standard is it takes more into accounting than just lighting. And it takes things like, the air quality. It takes the ergonomics of the furniture or any type of desk or chair or anything in that space. And there's a list of a whole bunch of other ones. But, to me, it's a very holistic view of, how when people need to be indoors, how they can most promote health and well-being while that person has to be in that space, whether it's as a patient, as a staff, as a visitor, but they look at that holistically. And here it is, right? So, again, like I said, you can see the little blue arrow, that's pointing to the light. And so there's a feature there where, you need to have met certain criteria in each of these categories, right? So air quality, water quality, nourishment, light, which we talked about, movement, thermal comfort, sound, right? So there's a lot of things being done with ceiling tiles that are sound dampening, or even, sound dampening in fixtures, light fixtures that are being suspended, right, to kind of absorb some of that sound. Different materials that would be used, right? Are they recyclable materials? Things, obviously that affect the mind, and then things for the community. So again, what I like about this is there's, light is in here, but they take into consideration a lot of other elements. So again, you can see it here. Again, you can, for more information, obviously you can Google it and you can actually flip through it. But they consider requirements for both visual acuity, comfort, and human health. So visual acuity basically means do I have enough light to do the task that I need to do? So if you're a nurse and you're tending to a patient, do I have enough light to actually administer the help that I need to administer? And then comfort, and then is the light not so bright that it's giving me a headache? And then how does that relate to your physical and mental health? And they also talk about luminaire, right? So if you're trying to choose a light fixture for that, they give you information on the spectral, like what does it need to be in terms of spectral data, the luminance levels, which is these IES files, which are kind of photometric layouts, and then obviously on color, which if you're not familiar, CRI is the color rendering index. It goes from kind of 0 to 100. Obviously, closer to 100 is kind of closer to the sun, right? So you're obviously going to want in a healthcare facility indoors, you're going to want 80 CRI at a minimum, preferably 90 CRI or above. And then TM30, which is kind of a new thing. Again, it's been published by the IES, but it's actually a better metric than CRI to understand color, because CRI only looks at a certain, I believe it's maybe 9 palettes of different color, whereas the TM30 is looking at, maybe 4 or 5 times the different palettes to give you a better idea, not of just, the vividness of the color, but also the saturation of the color. And when I talk about saturation, you can think about things like, if you're in a retail store or something like that, and you see, an end display, they may be using very saturated light because they want the colors of the genes to really be blue and really saturated. But in healthcare, generally, you want a balance between what I would call fidelity and saturation and vividness. You want kind of a balance between those three. And then there's different ways of measuring, again, the amount of light that's being able to get to the eye. So there's equivalent melanoptic lux, which is EML. And then there's also something called the CS metric, which is a Circadian Stimulus metric. These were developed by two different groups. They, on the surface, generally are talking about the same things, how much light is actually getting to the eye, for how, what type of duration, color temperature, but they do vary in different ways, whereas one is, really pushing maybe a higher color temperature and a shorter duration, whereas the other one maybe is kind of more of a softer, over the course of a day, maybe making smaller changes. But again, two different measurements that are both out there and are gaining traction. We won't go through all of this, but again, this more has to do with the Wells standard of, basically the preconditions versus the optimizations. So again, I just want to put it out there, but lots of things like visual balance, creating light environments that enhance visual comfort, occupant control of lighting environments. So allowing the people in that space to actually have control of the lighting can be really important for that person to be able to know that when they want to dim the lights, they can, and they can do it easily, without a lot of confusion. So this is the Circadian Stimulus. Again, I won't go too deep into it, but you should, just be aware. This is the Lighting Research Center is the one that developed this. And again, this has to do with, how much light is entering the eye and the visual response curve, right? So has to do with spectrum, duration, and obviously light distribution of, being able to actually, get to the eye. And, there's different ways of measuring it. So, obviously, generally they're saying that having a CS metric of kind of greater than 0.3 during the day is really important. And then having it less than 0.1 in the evening is really important. So this is, really to get your body to start winding down before you go to bed. So if you've noticed on your phones now, there's, obviously something called an amber, kind of a night setting, right? So at sundown, when the sun goes down, your phone kind of goes into kind of that orange yellow glow. And that's all related to this, right? It's going to dim your phone down, and it's going to change that color temperature, maybe from a cool or neutral color to kind of a really warm color. And again, that knows that your eye is obviously seeing that. So, it will be good to just help your body kind of wind down for the day. And again, just really has to do with, could be office workers, teachers, especially in the winter months, right? So really hard because your days are very short. You're not getting naturally a lot of light coming, from outside, right? You might wake up and it's dark. You go to work, and when you leave work, it's still dark, right? And so your body is not, just not. It takes, months to kind of get used to that. And then what do you know? We're going back, right? We're going to go back into spring and summer where your days are getting longer again. So, again, this is really more evident in a lot of spaces that, like the Northeast and the Northwest, places like Seattle. And so, now I'm blanking, but it's basically the seasonal affective disorder where people are, they're kind of get more melancholy and sad in the winter months because they're just not getting that access to natural light. Just again, more, from the IES about papers, so there are lots of things if you want to go do research, that, and there's some links on here too, that if you get this presentation, you can go through and look at that a little bit more. I just want to make sure that we get to the next polling question. And so what advantages, or what do you see as the greatest advantage of human-centric lighting? So now that you've kind of maybe gotten a little bit more around that, take a look here and and let me know what you think. Obviously, providing visual comfort and enhanced acuity could be providing time of day awareness, enhancing mood or productivity, well-being. Could also be looking towards the future, right? So looking at color tunable systems and open API controls. We haven't really talked too much about that, but that's really the idea that, people would be able to write programs, onto that software, and they could create kind of their own, kind of day-night cycles based on their specific application, right? Because even though we're talking about healthcare, there's lots of different, kind of day-night scenarios that could go with an elderly care facility versus a place like, just a standard public hospital.
We'll take a few moments here to get our responses, and then we will publish. Okay, Jeff, we have the results in.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so really, a lot of you, almost half, are talking about it in terms of the greatest advantages: enhancing mood, productivity, and well-being. So, I would personally, I didn't want to sway anyone, but I personally agree with that, especially right now. We're still trying to get. There's still a lot of research being done about how, if you really want to try and get someone into a specific circadian entrainment. So I think that's coming. I think, again, a lot of lighting designers will tell you they don't want to prescribe light, right? Because they're not doctors, and there's still so much research to be done. But I think we can all agree that there's things that, not necessarily circadian entrainment, but things like enhancing the mood of the people in the space, the productivity or the health recovery, I would call that, maybe in the healthcare space, and just the overall general well-being. So, it's just some good answers there. And it's quickly, we have a couple of healthcare case studies, right? So we have some research here where, Cree Lighting and McLaren, which is out of Michigan, we did some things where we did different types of color tunability in different spaces with nurses stations and things like that. The lights were dimmed down at 8 o'clock to signal quiet time. The housekeeping reports were easier to see what they're cleaning because they would pop the lights on whenever that schedule required them to come into a space. There were comments that we had gotten from the staff that basically talked about they felt safer at the property at night because you can see on the right it's kind of yellow and dim, and we kind of really brightened that up, and it just kind of gave a great overall kind of sense of safety and comfort. So again, you can find more about this. There's the links there, but just a really good, and that was a whole, kind of a whole healthcare network. So a lot of good research that we got from that. So what I want to close with is really this idea, right? We've been talking a lot about natural light and light getting to the eye and productivity, mood, and how we affect that, right? So, at Cree, obviously, we're looking at, creating solutions, for those indoor spaces that can actually allow people to capture the essence of natural light. And that was kind of the question that we posed to ourselves, right? That is kind of the breakthrough. Okay, we understand that people like to sit next to windows. They loved cars with sunroofs. They loved to have a beach house with windows going all the way around the front. So how can we help get people that don't have the ability to be sitting outside while they're working every day, some sort of access to that? And what we came up with was a solution called our Arcadian Dynamic Skylight, right? So this fixture is a 2x2, right? So it fits into kind of the same type of housing that a 2x2 fixture would fit in the ceiling today, but it's composed of kind of a 3D type, like a 3D type design where you have a regress of 3 inches, and you have this blue panel, and then you can see kind of these sun panels that go around all the four sides. And what that does is basically gives you that feeling of like a skylight, right? Where you don't have access to windows because of the design and it's too expensive to try and find a way to design it in, or you're not on the top floor, right? Because if you're not on the top floor of a building or a space, it's obviously, pretty much impossible to get light all the way down to these other floors. So how it works is, we talked about there's a sky, there's these sun panels, and there's a whole east to west feature, right? So 2 of the sun panels are considered the east sun. 2 of the panels on the other side are considered the west sun. And what that allows us to do is really control the theater of sun and sky. It's a dynamic daylighting solution that also allows people in that space to kind of tie into the cadence of the day. And it's really easy to install because it fits into the existing ceiling design that's already designed out there. So it's not just for new construction. It can go right into a T-grid ceiling or anything like that. And it fits right into a 2x2, T-grid ceiling, or it can be designed into like a hard ceiling if you wanted to. And then it's controlled by a wireless network. So again, you're not having to, the people that are actually going to install it, it's really easy. They don't have to pull wires all the way through the plenum down to a switch. Everything talks wirelessly in kind of a local secure network. So you don't need to connect into your healthcare network's Wi-Fi. And that was really important. That's really one of the things that the lighting designers and specifiers in healthcare told us is do not try, it cannot connect into, the healthcare IT network because there's lots of sign-offs and they're very, obviously there's a lot of concerns about hacking and things like that. So this lives in its own kind of wireless mesh network and it's all localized. So it doesn't need to tie in to anything, any of the building stuff. Now, if you want to, you can tie it into your building management system, but you don't need to, right? So if that's a concern. And so what it does is, again, you're imagining on the right side, this is kind of a sunrise, right? 6 a.m. in the morning. You can see the blue sky is kind of dimmer, maybe a little bit more towards a purple, like a sky on a sunrise. And those 2 right panels, if you can look straight ahead and then to the right, they're a little bit kind of more yellow, right? Because it's as if the sun is coming up. And then it's slowly going to move. And again, this is going to happen very slowly. So you're not going to have these huge jumps, right? It's going to be every 30 seconds, it's going to slowly be moving kind of towards a cooler and more brighter fixture. And then as you get to noon, you can imagine, because the sun is directly overhead, all of those light panels are equally lit up. They're really bright. They went from 3,000 Kelvin now to maybe 5,000 Kelvin. So high intensity, this will be like the highest brightness of the day, roughly, anywhere from that 12 to 1 o'clock. And then it'll basically go all the way across, right? So it'll start coming back around towards 3 p.m. and then towards this, basically the sunrise time, the sunsetting time of, that 6 or 7 o'clock. And those sun panels, it's kind of hard to see here, but the 2 panels now on the back and the left are now kind of illuminated in that really warm look, right? So it's the sun, it gives you the feeling that the sun has actually moved across the sky. And that happens just very subtly, right? So people aren't looking up and saying, what is happening, right? It's not a light effect experience, right? It's supposed to be more subconscious, and it just happens slowly over, let's call it a 12-hour time frame. And this is what you would need to kind of make that happen, right? So you would, we like putting 4 of these together, feels kind of really more like a real skylight. So it's almost like an 8x8. And then, here's your different components, right? So you just need a little gateway that gets powered. That helps the touch screen that goes on the wall talk to these fixtures. So again, not a lot of components used, but, just a great little system if you're looking to kind of bring the outdoors in. And there are just some images that we have in some of the different healthcare spaces. And again, you can put these into different types. Of course, you see we like kind of the 4-pack, but you could put these, 6 or 8, together. You could put 2 together. Just allows you for a lot of modularity. And then just to summarize, right, so we talked a lot about these, but just good to touch on, right? So lighting design considerations. Really important to have enough light to support health and well-being and be aware of the energy implications, right? So increase of energy. You might see a small increase of energy to meet circadian lighting guidelines, right? Because you're going to need a certain level of brightness at a certain time. So it's not always going to be low and dim. But again, if you're willing to, maybe use a few more watts, you're already saving a lot with LED. It might be it might be worth it. Obviously, you want to consider the guidelines from well building, so you want to do more research around that, and there's a lot of research going on there. Lots of case studies, so we have some links there you can click into and learn more about it. And then obviously taking into consideration those viewpoints and direction, right? So how do you get more light to the eye? It may require some extra design time, and the budget might be a little bit more, but in terms of giving a design that's going to be a lot more, longer lasting and more effective in terms of health and well-being, it's really important. And then think about building those flexible color tunable systems and open API controls. Don't be scared. There's lots of good systems out there. We have one, but there's lots of others that have good systems, and just again allows you to be a little bit future-proof as more research comes in. You'll have the ability to fine-tune those systems for circadian or biological behavioral effects as we get more research on that. So with that, I'd like to just thank you for your time and answering your polling questions, and we'll open it up to any questions that might be out there.
Thank you, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take your questions. Remember that you can type your questions into the text box on your screen and then press enter. We'll pause for just a moment while we assemble our questions. First question, Jeff, that we have coming in. Have you found that it's hard to select interior finishes when using SmartCast color tunable lighting, since the color temperature changes, therefore affecting how the colors in the finishes are perceived?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and that is 100% true, right? So, obviously, lots of designs are built around, warm light. So, woods really are enhanced by kind of that warmer spectrum light, whereas other types of finishes, maybe like a light gray or something like that, are actually going to be better in a cooler light. So it is something to take into consideration if you're going to go down a kind of a tunable white direction. You're going to want to maybe have a sample of something warm, a light source that's warm, and a light source that's cool, just to make sure that whatever you're that you like it in both of those lighting atmospheres. So yeah, I mean, definitely something you want to take into consideration when you're thinking about that, because nothing worse than designing in some rich walnut and realizing that in that cool mode that it looks terrible. So something that as you go through your design, you just want to make sure that you do check that.
Thank you, Jeff. Patients should not have control over the lighting when it comes to circadian rhythm. Can you talk to us about controls for these products?
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with that, right? So, if you're designing a space for the people in that space around circadian lighting, you would not put a control or a controller in range where someone could go in and change that design. So the great thing about the control system for the Arcadian is you can have what they call a profile, right? So let's imagine you work with the lighting designer, or you are the lighting designer, and you're working with people in that space and saying, okay, this is going to be for the nurses station space, right? And you go in, you create a profile on that touch screen that basically is going to run from 24/7, right? And it's going to run warm to cool, and it's going to be exactly, you're going to look at the research and you're going to say, okay, for nurses, it's best to do a 12-hour lighting system because nurses are changing shifts every 12 hours, and this is the best, this is going to be the best for them. This is what we want for this space. Now, you can still have that controller available to, let's call it the health administrator, manager, or the facility manager, because let's just say for some reason you wanted to override that for a short amount of time. There are abilities that, kind of what they call a preset that you're able to just kind of click a button, right? It can go, go right to midday or go right to morning, right? And you can basically temporarily change the lighting in that space. But let's just say, after 5 minutes or whatever, if there's nobody in that space, that it's going to revert back to that profile that you programmed in, and no one can change that profile except for, whoever the facility person or whoever has the password to get in and actually modify it. So, the controls for the occupants in the space was more of, if you weren't necessarily doing a circadian rhythm, feature, but maybe if in a patient room where, when the nurse comes in, she's going to want a button that says, exam time, right? And the lights are able to pop up. And then she happens to leave, for instance, and forgets to, dim the lights down, that the patient then could, have the ability to then, dim the lights back down so that they could watch TV or something like that. So I agree. If you're creating kind of a circadian rhythm, program, definitely do not want the people in that space to have access to that.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. How do you design tunable lighting that is beneficial for both the patients and the staff?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. So I think, again, with the help of the lighting designer and the people that are actually work in that space, you're going to want to do a lot of observations about how that space is being used, how much time are people in those spaces in that space. For instance, I keep kind of go back to like a rehab space or a nurse's station. I mean, in a rehab space, you're going to look at probably something more gradual, more subtle, that the day is just kind of going tied to kind of a normal day. Whereas in a very specific space like a nurse's station, it may be a little off-putting for the patients if they're kind of just walking through, because it may not be it's going to be tailored more towards the nurses and making sure that the staff is going to be on their more on their circadian rhythm. But the patients generally aren't going to be in that space for longer than, let's say, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, right? And that's not enough to really kind of affect them, to get them off of their own circadian rhythm. So, you got to, I think, look at the spaces, get a lot of inputs and do a lot of observations about what that space is being used for. And if it's being used, across many, if it's, say, 30% this, 30% this, and 30% this, then, you maybe need to back it down and, okay, let's look at, maybe we don't do a circadian lighting system necessarily. Maybe we just do a profile that's called follow the day, and then that follow the day is just basically following what's going on outside, and so that gives everybody in that space the same kind of equal connection to what the real day is actually happening.
Great, Jeff. Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and so we'll now have to wrap up our webinar. And if you'd like to watch a replay of this webinar, it will be found on the MCD